Thank you, Councillor. We'll move on now to item C. Councillor Trenholm again. Emergency shelter at Frank Miller Street. Councillor.
Yeah, so my intent in bringing this up is not to revisit it or to uncover issues, I guess. But if I were to say that there's one consistent theme when I went door to door, and it wouldn't even be when I went door to door just in the area where the shelter is, it's anywhere in Ward 5, almost every second or third house. And this came from people who, they say everything is fine in the city. They love the city. It's a wonderful city. And they go, well, there's just one thing. So I think they said, can you bring this issue? I said, sure, I have no problem, because being your representative, right? And again, I don't want to revisit all things, but in essence, there was 3 issues that people talked to me consistently about. One is, I guess, in terms of how the shelter got to be where it is. And one was transparency, because people would like to know if that was the only location or the other locations that were looked at, and what made that the most suitable location. That's what they've asked about, right? And the other issue, if you're looking at the hours, and so 5 to 8, even people who are, I could use vehemently opposed to it, they would be much more open to it if it was 24 hours a day. Because the challenge is the temperature at 7:55 in the morning is not much different than at 8:05 in the morning. And I don't think we do justice to the community when we make those decisions. And I'm saying, I mean, all due respect, I mean, I just know that supporting the people who are unhoused is a top priority for the residents and myself and for council. But I think in some way it pitted two populations that are vulnerable against each other. It pitted the seniors who really feel vulnerable, and meeting with them, and there's from being legally blind to mobility issues, and there's just a number of issues and concerns, but also the unhoused, right? So we want to help. So I guess, and the other piece was just consultation. So that would be the third piece, is that there was a growing feeling that decisions, I know there was a meeting held, but that there was decisions were already in place, already finalized before that, right? And in my mind, under such a major project, consulting with, let's say, the residents, but also consulting with the manor. And I know it was a provincial, but I think being able to have the council and the province working together and doing those consultations, and it's not that people, if you know what the options are, and I guess it's giving people the voice, I guess, and trying to figure out what's the best case. So those were the 3 issues that were brought forward. So I figured I'd bring them forward here. And again, my intent is not to get into to revisit everything, but if people want to comment, I guess please do. And I'll leave the floor to everybody else. Thanks.
Thank you, Your Worship. I find this a little frustrating because lack of consultation, I don't feel like that is an accurate representation of what happened. There are multiple public meetings that happen, and people are free to come to those meetings. All of our email addresses, all of our phone numbers are online. I can tell you for this, not one single person reached out to me for or against it. So if you want to then have issues after the fact, you had plenty of time beforehand to raise those issues to us. And there were issues that were raised at public meetings, and one of those issues was no one wanted 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. And one of the things that we said was, what about 5 p.m. to 8 a.m.? And the people who live in that area said, yes. That is much, much better than what was originally proposed. I mean, mayor and former councillor at the time went to those buildings and discussed with people, and I don't know what was solidified, because it wasn't solidified until a couple of months ago when it came back to us and we had other stipulations that we put onto the province wanting to build in that area. So I just find that very frustrating, and I get it that you're just bringing up, issues that you've heard, but I don't often think that most of these are really all that accurate. People had time to come and consult with us. Whether they did or didn't, that was their choice. Our emails are public. They can reach out to us anytime. I can't speak for the transparency of where the shelter was going to go or other places it would go. But I know that we worked very hard to make sure that the people who came to the meetings and the people who voiced their concerns at the meetings were heard and people were happy with it. So it gets a little frustrating when then afterwards people say, I'm not happy with that. You do have to reach out and you do have to contact people and you do have to make your voice heard. We can't read minds, and after the fact of saying you're not happy with it, well, we can't really do anything then. You do have to speak up beforehand. So yeah, I find that just a little frustrating because I do feel like we did a really good job, and I feel like we listened to people, and I feel like we really took into consideration all those things, with the exception, I will say, with the exception of maybe where the site was going to go. I don't know what the other options were for that at the time. But the other things that are up here, I think that we did a really good job.
I agree with Nick on a lot, and it's very hard. There's so many sides looking at this, and it's hard, especially when you have more than one vulnerable population that you're talking about. You're talking about your seniors and you're talking about your unhoused. I did vote no. It wasn't mainly due to the location. It was because of how I felt the staffing was being put out. So that was my big hiccup, and how it was being run and their experience and so on. But I do feel that the location, I know I've seen people online saying, well, what about Greenwood Drive? The thing people has to remember is this population we're speaking of, they rely on public transit. They rely on being able to walk to things. They rely on day programming at mental health and addictions. They rely on the province for quite a few things. That's not the city's responsibility. We have helped the province as much as we possibly can along the way. We put in many stipulations, like the opening 3 hours earlier, the 5, and they actually start, I think, at 4 now, and you check in at 5, so it's even earlier than it was proposed. The thing too, that security-wise, it's where it's at now, it's completely surrounded, except for the highway side, by provincial areas that are provincial responsibility. So you don't have people in an apartment building with a private owner having to get his own security, and then you have the province with security for the hospital and the shelter. It all falls under one. So it made sense that it was easier for the province to try and navigate the security concerns and make it work going forward. Like I said, the daytime programming at community mental health in the area, that's a big one. Up there, they don't just do day programming. If somebody comes in and they need sneakers, they need clothes, well, the workers up at the hospital are finding that for them. And they know who is out and about in the run of a day. The pharmacies are close by, the grocery stores are close by, and the public transit. So that was a lot of the main reason why. And like it was mentioned, the mayor and the former councillor went, and since it's opened, or just before it opened last week, I believe we had police go door to door up there and ask the residents, like, how are you feeling? What's your concerns? They're very proactive. And I think that this council is big into being proactive as much as we possibly can. Some things are out of our hands, obviously, but I think this was one that we really tried to get out ahead of. And I think considering so many what ifs. I really feel that we did, even though I voted no, because I still believe that the staffing part was whatever, but the site, I really feel that, you know, putting this population down on Greenwood, what would it do? They'd have to walk further uptown to get to all the services they require every day, so, anyway, that's my spiel.
Yeah, I was not gonna say anything, and then I was gonna say something and not. I think at the end of the day, regardless, and the reality is, regardless the location chosen for the site would not have been well looked at by some in the community. There would have been issues of, you know, I don't think that's the best location. So there was no ideal location that I think the community would come together and say that's the perfect location. There'd always be somebody around. I think to Councillor Adams' point, and when they first came, I voted against it too because I had lots of questions and thoughts about their timing and things they were proposing just didn't make a lot of sense to me, and sure enough, it took a hell of a lot of time to get it open. So I don't think there was a great location for it. I do feel for the residents in the area because I do think they're legitimately concerned, but I think we've tried as a council leading into the final vote to put in stipulations that would at least help the residents in the area feel safer, whether or not it's the extra police services, the extra police officer, trying to get a sidewalk in there, that sort of stuff, fencing off the property. I think as a council, we did a lot to make sure that we made it as safe and as acceptable as possible for residents in the area. So.
Thank you, councillors and council, and I'll speak to it really briefly, just so we get clarity in terms of how the process followed here. A growing number of unhoused persons in our community, living in tents, living in sheds, living in all kinds of places that you wouldn't want anyone living in. It really came to a head here probably a year and a half ago when we had that incredibly cold snap in Summerside. But that evening we had to actually open up our fire hall, and we had firefighters spending the night in order to make sure that there was somewhere for people to go who needed to go to a certain place. Around the same time, we had asked the province, remembering that the provision of emergency shelter is the province's responsibility, so we'd asked the province to include or create a shelter here in the city of Summerside. We do have existing shelters here in Summerside. There are a few. There are none that are in the emergency that are emergency shelters open for one set period of time to another, but they exist, and they exist within our community. The province ultimately applied for a restricted use application. Pursuant to the restricted use application, council followed all of the process and procedures and that are set out in our bylaws and our any directives with respect to how we have to engage with the community. In addition to that, as was mentioned here, myself and the councillor at the time for the ward went out to speak to residents directly, listened to their concerns, and then actually went back and posted flyers in their lobby to let them know when this meeting was here in council. That was above and beyond the requirements. When that restricted use application came from the province, the application came for that site. So if you want to ask the province about other options, that is their shelter, not ours, you can ask the province why they ultimately decided to pursue that the restricted use application for that site. And then council, as was mentioned here as well, included a number of conditions on that, both included conditions with respect to the site security, so the fencing, additional resources for police services, so the funding for an additional police officer, and police are up in that area, having their presence felt, particularly during the open and closing times. The other items were the 8 to 5 was the change, and I'm going to draw a blank on what the last one was. And then also to Councillor Adams' point, there were we had a discussion about the operational staff, and as of today, I did hear last week that Jody Sentner, who was running the Lifehouse project here in Summerside, is running the emergency shelter and I think that's good news for our community. We've seen what Jody has done for so many women and children who are unhoused and fleeing situations of domestic violence. And last night there were 10 people who slept in the shelter who didn't have to sleep in a tent or in a shed or in someone's backyard. And while we are always balancing the needs of many in our community, it is hard to balance the needs of anyone against that. So with this, again, this isn't something that we do revisit. Council made a decision. Council has approved the restricted use application. There is a 12-month review. So really, ultimately, in 12 months, council will look at what those requirements were and can come back and see how it went. As a final point, I did speak to the Deputy Chief of Police the other day, who visited with her, along with our chief. And I'm not sure, Ron, were you someone from fire there? I'm not sure. Ken there, our Deputy Chief for Fire Services, as well as Jody Sentner, who's running the shelter, and they went door to door to all of the seniors' residences in the area. The feedback to me, at least, was that the response was positive, that they were happy the police were there and that it was going to be well run, and on we go. So I guess at 12 months, we'll have an opportunity to revisit it. Make sense? Awesome.